In the vast ocean of indie platformers, both 2D and 3D, it can sometimes be difficult to come across new hidden gems. I mean, honestly, there are a lot of 2D platformers on Steam, so whenever a new one comes out, it has to have its own defining traits to really stick out, and while that might sound obvious, you would be surprised at the amount of shovelware or otherwise mediocre titles out there. That's not to say there aren't any good 2D platformers in the indie scene these days though, because there are plenty covering all different styles of gameplay, like Cuphead, Shovel Knight, Freedom Planet, Cave Story, just to name a few. All of these share a common trait in being 2D platformers, but their execution is so much different and unique from one another, and that's exactly the sort of thing I'm looking for. And as it turns out, I wouldn't have to look too far for another standout 2D platformer to play. See, I've been following a lot of content creators over the years, mostly in the gaming sphere, but the particular creator of interest today is Nintendrew. I've always been an avid fan of his content, but something I never knew about him was his previous background in game development, which eventually led him to creating his own game, C.A.R.L, or C.A.R.L. C.A.R.L is a 2D action platformer created by the aforementioned Nintendrew, or Andrew Kenady, as well as Matt Bitner of Morningstar Game Studio. While I'm not too familiar with Morningstar Game Studio, I was very excited to give C.A.R.L a shot regardless, which makes me very grateful to say that I was sent a review code to check out the game early, so big thank you to Nintendrew, and with that said, let's see what C.A.R.L is all about. C.A.R.L follows C.A.R.L, or the Computer Automated Resource Locator, a little robot dude. One day they're sent by their creator Herman Brent to infiltrate his former best friend James Kent's factory to uncover the secrets of his facility and take it down from the inside. But doing this isn't so simple. He'll have to progress through the depot of unusable machines and parts, or the dump, to collect tech units, unlock new abilities and weapon upgrades, and eventually, maybe meet the man himself. The dump acts as the game's hub world, housing many of Dr. Kent's old robots that were thrown out for being defective. Here you can also find each of the game's 4 worlds, a hint tent, some upgrade shops, and some extra robots that you can rescue throughout the game. We'll talk a little bit more about the upgrade shops later in the video, but for now let's get into the meat of the gameplay. C.A.R.L isn't exactly the linear platformer you may think it is. Kinda. The first world sets the groundwork for future worlds, albeit in a bite-sized and easily digestible way, but going into World 2, I was surprised to see the levels became larger and shifted more in the direction of an exploration-based puzzle platformer. The main reason for this is that you'll need to find free tech units to beat a level, but to get those units, you'll have to solve some puzzles, hit some switches, open doors, and do some good old platforming. I think C.A.R.L hits a pretty good sweet spot, balancing a decent amount of platforming with its more open-ended level design, and I don't say that lightly, they really do want you to explore every nook and cranny of these levels. I really love this approach because it helps set the game apart from the typical 2D platformer, though on the other side of the token, I do think the open-endedness can go a little overboard at points. Since a big focus of the levels is on hitting switches to open doors in other sections of the level to further help progression, it can be kind of confusing to navigate them at times. I sorta get what the game is going for here, but I think what it needs is a better visual indicator of which door is opening whenever you hit a switch, because as is, the game just flashes a red arrow in the general direction of said door. It's far from a game-breaking issue, but having something to help players avoid getting lost would be super helpful, because otherwise these are very fun and engaging levels. And some are more linear than others, while still retaining a hint of fun exploration through hidden collectibles, like the 4th world starts focusing more on tight and difficult level design, really testing your skills and familiarity with your abilities, and it feels great to play through due to how smoothly C.A.R.L controls and the moves you gain, which I'll talk about later. But if you had to ask me which world was my favorite, I think it would be a tie between the 3rd and the 4th. The 3rd world introduces a new enemy which C.A.R.L can't beat on his own, the Sweepers, which insta-kill on contact. These things make for a lot of great intense moments, most notably Free Through Free, which has you navigating a maze of obstacles to open pathways to tech units, all while having to avoid 2 sweepers which are constantly patrolling the entire map. I would be lying if I said this level wasn't a tad frustrating at points due to the checkpoint placement, since the sweepers' movement patterns are very erratic and can be hard to determine without the help of the maps, but little did I know a subtle detail was helping me in the background, quite literally. The brown tiles in the background actually show you the paths that the sweepers take, while the blue tiles are where you're safe. Visual cues and hints aren't always very subtle whenever it comes to the hidden collectibles in the game, but stuff like this and the obstacle movement being tied to the beat of the background music were super cool details to discover, and I really appreciate the extra work that went into this because it makes it easy to tell that a lot of care went into designing the levels. In terms of the moveset, C.A.R.L starts off with a regular jump and a basic blaster to take down enemies with, but as you progress throughout the adventure, you'll earn special tech units that grant C.A.R.L new abilities like a double jump and a dash, but those aren't the only upgrades at your disposal. You can also find blueprints hidden in a few levels to bring back to the free-roaming automated repair technician, or FART, great name by the way, and he'll provide some bonus upgrades like halving the damage you take or gaining a triple jump. And these are completely optional, so there's quite a bit to work towards in the game if you really want to. Either way, C.A.R.L feels super smooth to control, moving and stopping on a dime, and even little things like the jump physics feel superb. If I had to give out a negative though, dashing doesn't feel quite as good as the other moves you gain. The problem is that you're expected to double tap the joystick or D-pad left or right to begin dashing, which is kind of difficult to do consecutively, but not only that, but sometimes I would accidentally dash when using the joystick, so later in the game when platforming becomes a lot more precise, you kind of have to use the D-pad to dash safely and effectively. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's any way to fix this sort of thing other than mapping the dash to the shoulder buttons, and it's a shame because it is a very fun move, but it can be equally frustrating to time correctly. Aside from that, C.A.R.L also has access to weapon upgrades, which can be done by collecting hidden medals in certain stages and bringing them back to Sarge, after which you can purchase upgrades for your weapon's fire rate, speed, and power. Oh, and you'll want to make sure to collect plenty of scrap by defeating enemies and bosses, since it's the game's form of currency. Later in the game, you can also purchase free more weapons, which offer slightly different playstyles. The triple shot, which is short range but very powerful, the grenade launcher, which shoots in an arc, ending in a small explosion, which can also hurt you, and the rocket launcher, which is basically the blaster but slower. I never found myself needing to switch weapons since the enemies aren't that much of a nuisance, but I think they're fun to use regardless, especially against some of the bosses. I want to make a formal apology to Charlotte. I literally beat her in like 10 seconds thanks to the rocket launcher. Keep in mind, not all of the bosses are that easy, Charlotte just happened to be an exception. I don't have much to say about the other bosses. They are somewhat basic, but they're fun changes of pace and do ramp up the difficulty quite a bit here and there. Moving on, the worlds are segmented into 4 different levels, each of which requiring a certain number of tech units to unlock. Much like Mario 64's Power Stars, these act as a main collectible for story progression. Like I mentioned, 3 of these things are found in each level, as well as a bonus tech unit, and yes, this means if you go out of your way to collect them, you can outright skip certain levels. I love it when games incentivize different playstyles like this. You can play for every level if you like, or you can be a speedy gremlin and skip over a few. It's nothing groundbreaking for sure, but C.A.R.L feels like the kind of game that would be super fun to speedrun because of that. Alongside the bonus tech units, there are a bunch of other hidden collectibles to be found, like hidden music discs that you can listen to through the jukebox and the robo-bar, medals which can be used to upgrade C.A.R.L's weapon. There's also these trading cards that I think are dropped randomly which contain info on the game's cast of characters. Lastly, there are 4 arcade game modules to be found throughout the game, and if you bring them back to ARPA and the robo-bar, you can play some recreations of classic arcade games. While not at all necessary, this is something I've always loved, having extra mini-games to play within games. Obviously, they aren't something you would spend a lot of time on given how simple and easy these recreations are, but I still appreciate the extra effort that went into adding them as they are fun distractions. Typically, with platformers, I find that certain collectibles aren't quite as satisfying to collect as others, so I feel no draw to go out of my way to find all of them, but C.A.R.L's lineup of collectible goodies all offer up some fun and neat little rewards that make them each satisfying in their own right while still not being too frustrating to find. They also make for great replay value if you end up missing a few collectibles. I imagine it'll be a really fun game to 100% complete. C.A.R.L is a game that isn't afraid to wear its inspirations on its sleeve. From the witty and funny dialogue to the game's core design, C.A.R.L isn't shy to referencing games both retro and modern. One of the game's most clear inspirations though is Super Paper Mario. The introduction of each of the bosses was handled in a similar manner. There's also the trading cards, which are essentially just Super Paper Mario's catch cards, not to mention the third world's boss, Charlotte, which... do I really need to say what this is referencing? All of this to say that it's very clear C.A.R.L was a love letter to some of Andrew's favorite games, and you can see that passion oozing in every corner of the game. C.A.R.L is a solid, super fun 2D platformer that I think is pretty unique from many others I've played. For a two-man project, C.A.R.L offers up quite a bit in terms of main story content, while also still having plenty of replay value through the hidden collectibles. Although I don't think C.A.R.L will blow your mind, I still think it's worth giving a shot. It doesn't overstay its welcome, so it's a fun romp while it lasts, and I can definitely see myself coming back to it. C.A.R.L has a ton of care put into it, so if the game at all interests you, then I urge you to check it out. By the time this video goes up, C.A.R.L should be out on Steam and all major consoles, so we'll link those platforms in the description if you're interested, but in the meantime, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you later.